The winter of 1944 settled over the Ardennes like a suffocating shroud, smothering the dense forests and winding valleys beneath deep layers of ice and snow. In the first days of December, the landscape seemed eerily calm, too calm for a world still locked in the grip of global war. The tall, skeletal silhouettes of the fir trees stood motionless, their branches heavy with frost, casting long blue shadows under the pale daylight. The villages scattered throughout the region, small clusters of stone houses huddled beside narrow roads, appeared frozen in time, as if war had finally passed them by. But beneath this deceptive silence, the ground trembled with the unseen footsteps of armies preparing for one of the most brutal confrontations of the entire Second World War. To the Allied soldiers stationed along the Ardennes line, the forest felt more like a miserable prison than a battlefield. Bitter winds knifed through the seams of their uniforms, freezing their breath into crystals that clung to their scarves and collars. Snowstorms swept across the region without warning, reducing visibility to just a few meters and erasing entire supply trails overnight. Many of the soldiers were exhausted, young, and poorly equipped for winter warfare. They believed this sector was quiet, almost too quiet, and had been told repeatedly that the Germans were collapsing, running out of manpower, oil, and hope. The Ardennes, they were assured, was the last place the enemy could attempt an attack. Yet, only miles away, hidden deep within the labyrinthine woods and camouflaged ravines, the German Wehrmacht was preparing to strike with a fury not seen since the opening years of the war. Under the command of Adolf Hitler himself, an enormous counteroffensive was being assembled in secrecy. Tanks wrapped in white winter camouflage, artillery lined up silently beneath tree canopies, and infantry units trained relentlessly for a lightning breakthrough. Hitler believed that one decisive blow in the West, a blow that would split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and unravel their supply lines, could force the Western Allies into negotiating peace. His generals were skeptical, his fuel reserves dangerously low, and his forces stretched thin, but the gamble was set in motion. The code name, Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. History, however, would remember it by another name, the Battle of the Bulge. The geography of the Ardennes played a central role in the unfolding drama. Thick forests restricted movement, narrow roads funneled traffic into choke points, and steep ridges made armored warfare difficult. But these challenges also made the region ideal for a surprise attack. Morning fogs rolled down from the hills like slow-moving curtains of white, swallowing entire battalions from sight. Icicles clung to the edges of bridges, and frozen rivers groaned beneath sheets of ice thick enough to support marching columns of soldiers. When the sun did manage to pierce through the clouds, it reflected off the snow in blinding flashes that disoriented gunners and snipers alike. The landscape itself became a weapon, harsh, unforgiving, indifferent to the suffering of the men who fought upon it. On the Allied side, the front line was stretched thin with inexperienced divisions, many freshly arrived from training camps, holding positions across a 100-kilometer sector. Some men decorated small Christmas trees inside their foxholes, hoping to celebrate the holiday before heading home. Others wrote hurried letters to their families, describing the cold, the boredom, and the faint hope that the war was nearing its end. Supplies trickled slowly due to frozen roads, vehicles stalled in the icy mud, weapons jammed if they were not constantly cleaned and oiled. Commanders believed the Ardennes served as a recovery zone, a place for battered units to rest before the final push into Germany. The enemy, they assumed, had no strength left for a major offensive. Meanwhile, on the German side, thousands of troops marched night after night through the snow, guided only by dim lanterns and the pale glow of the moon on the treetops. Panzer crews ran silent drills inside canvassed hangars, practicing engine startups in freezing conditions. Elite SS units waited like coiled springs, their orders sealed until the last possible moment. Many German soldiers were veterans of earlier campaigns, Afrika Korps survivors, Eastern Front fighters hardened by years of brutality, and young recruits indoctrinated with the belief that this would be Germany's last chance to turn the tide. They carried with them both determination and desperation. Their boots were worn, their rations limited, and their spirits tested by years of defeat, yet they prepared for the offensive with grim resolve. The nights before the attack were filled with a strange mixture of stillness and restrained tension. Snowflakes drifted lazily downward, settling on tank hulls and artillery barrels. The forests seemed to hold their breath. German officers studied maps inside dimly lit command posts, their fingers tracing the twisting Belgian roads that led to critical Allied supply hubs, St. Vith, Bastogne, Malmedy. These towns, quiet, unremarkable, ordinary, were about to become symbols of defiance or collapse, depending on which side managed to seize them first. Every valley, ridge, and crossroads would soon be fought over with ferocity unimaginable to those who had walked these lands before the war. On the eve of the attack, the sky was a heavy ceiling of steel-gray clouds. Not even the moonlight could penetrate the blanket of snow-laden atmosphere. In some areas, Allied soldiers huddled together for warmth inside makeshift wooden huts, sipping weak coffee and listening to the crackling of small fires. Others remained on guard duty, stamping their feet to keep them from going numb. Some spoke of home, others of rumors that the war might end by spring. None imagined that tens of thousands of German troops were already positioned a mere stone's throw away, silent, concealed, and waiting for the order to unleash chaos. As midnight crept closer, the temperature plunged further. Ice formed along rifle triggers, metal canteens, and helmet straps. The wind whispered through the trees in long, mournful groans. German soldiers tightened their coats, adjusted their gear, and stared into the darkness ahead. They knew the risks. Fuel shortages could strand their tanks. Fog could blind their advances. Allied air power, when the skies cleared, could rain destruction upon them. But orders were orders. They believed this offensive might restore German pride or at the very least delay the inevitable long enough for a more favorable end. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the silence shattered like glass. The dark forests lit up with the sudden blaze of thousands of artillery shells, each exploding with an earth-shaking roar. Trees splintered into deadly shards. Foxholes collapsed under avalanches of dirt and snow. Allied units jolted awake to a nightmare they had never expected. The bombardment rolled across the Ardennes like a thunderstorm, a relentless wall of sound that echoed through the valleys and sent shockwaves through the earth. As the shellfire intensified, German infantry surged forward in massive waves, their silhouettes emerging from the morning mist like phantoms. The Allies, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. Communications lines were destroyed, radios malfunctioned in the cold, and commanders struggled to understand the scale of the attack. In some areas, German paratroopers dressed in captured American uniforms infiltrated behind Allied lines, spreading confusion and misdirection. Roadblocks appeared overnight. Bridges were seized. The entire front seemed to lurch backward under the pressure of the German assault, forming the massive, infamous bulge that would lend the battle its name. What began as a quiet winter defensive zone would soon transform into one of the most savage, chaotic, and pivotal battles of World War II. The snow would turn red with blood. The forests would burn. Tanks would freeze in place. Soldiers would vanish in sudden blizzards. And yet, amid the despair, acts of unimaginable courage would emerge. Moments that would shape not only the outcome of the war but the legacy of the soldiers who fought there. The Ardennes, once silent and serene, had become a crucible of fire, ice, and human endurance. And the world was about to witness the last great offensive of Nazi Germany, a desperate gamble that would either fracture the Allied advance or doom the German war machine forever. The first hours of the German counteroffensive unfolded like a violent awakening from a winter sleep. After the thunderous artillery barrage that ripped across the Ardennes before dawn, the landscape, once frozen in quiet stillness, erupted into chaotic motion. Snow-covered ridges shook under the pressure of exploding shells. The air filled with acrid smoke, drifting between the towering pines like a foul fog. Allied troops, disoriented and shivering from the cold, stumbled out of their shelters, unsure whether they were facing a localized attack or the opening salvo of a massive offensive. The truth would become alarmingly clear within minutes. This was no simple probing assault. This was a meticulously planned, full-scale German counterattack, one designed to fracture the Allied front and shift the balance of the war. German infantry surged forward with surprising coordination. Having trained for weeks in secrecy, many of them moved with the precision of veteran soldiers despite the crushing winter conditions. They advanced through narrow forest paths, over frozen fields, and along winding roads that cut through the Ardennes like pale ribbons beneath the snow. At their backs, artillery continued to pound Allied defensive positions, softening up strong points and throwing the front into disarray. Some units pushed through known gaps in the Allied line, exploiting areas where inexperienced American divisions held thin positions stretched across too wide a front. Others targeted specific towns and crossroads essential for controlling movement within the region. One of the first major targets was the small but strategically critical town of St. Vith. Perched on a network of roads, St. Vith acted as a junction connecting the northern and southern sectors of the Allied defense. Capturing it quickly would open pathways deeper into Belgium and threaten the Allied supply system. German commanders understood this well. Panzer divisions spearheaded their approach, their engines rumbling beneath layers of frost. The tanks' treads churned up snow and ice as they rolled forward, leaving behind deep, jagged scars in the frozen earth. Infantry followed closely, moving between tree lines and using the natural cover of the terrain to advance without drawing immediate fire. Allied units in the region found themselves overwhelmed. Communications were disrupted by the initial bombardment. Telephone lines had been severed or buried under fallen trees. Radio signals crackled with interference. Many commanders had to rely on couriers, soldiers racing through snow on foot or in jeeps, to deliver orders. This caused delays, misinterpretations, and, in some cases, complete confusion. Frontline infantry who attempted to mount a defense were shocked by the sheer number of German troops pressing against them. Within hours, several towns and outposts fell into enemy hands. Adding to the chaos, specially trained German commandos infiltrated behind Allied lines. Led by Otto Skorzeny, these soldiers wore captured American uniforms, drove American vehicles, and carried American weapons. Their mission was clear: sabotage, disorientation, and psychological disruption. They changed road signs, spread false rumors, and occasionally seized key crossroads. As news of these infiltrators spread among Allied troops, paranoia took hold. Soldiers began interrogating each other, demanding passwords and asking obscure questions about American culture to verify identities. Some units reported false sightings, believing every shadow or misplaced footstep to be evidence of a disguised German soldier. Meanwhile, the harsh winter conditions intensified the struggle. Snowstorms swept over the region at unpredictable intervals, reducing visibility to near zero. Soldiers described the weather as a second enemy, one that struck with equal ferocity. Winds whipped through valleys, carrying with them sharp pellets of ice that stung exposed skin. The cold seeped into bones, numbing fingers, making it harder to load rifles or tend to wounded comrades. Long marches through waist-deep snow exhausted even the most resilient troops. Vehicles stalled, engines froze, and fuel supplies dwindled. For the Germans, already suffering from shortages, every wasted drop of gasoline could spell disaster. For the Allies, resupplying units in the midst of the storm became a logistical nightmare. Despite these hardships, German forces made rapid progress in the first days. In the north, they pushed toward Malmedy, where American units scrambled to reposition amid mounting pressure. In the south, the town of Bastogne became a focal point. Roads converged there like spokes of a wheel, and controlling it meant controlling movement through the region. German forces understood this and moved aggressively to encircle it. Yet the town's defenders, consisting largely of the 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division, dug in and prepared for a siege. They were outnumbered, undersupplied, and freezing, but the defense of Bastogne would soon become a symbol of Allied resilience. Elsewhere, German armored columns encountered unexpected delays. The Ardennes terrain, so crucial to the initial surprise, began to work against them. Narrow forest roads became bottlenecks, slowing the movement of tanks, half-tracks, and supply vehicles. Snow drifts blocked smaller paths. Ice made hills treacherous, causing vehicles to slide or lose traction. The larger Tiger and Panther tanks struggled most of all. Their heavy weight made them formidable in combat but difficult to maneuver in dense, icy forests. At times, entire divisions were forced to halt for hours while engineers cleared obstacles or repaired damaged vehicles. Fuel shortages further complicated the German advance. Many units operated under strict fuel rationing, receiving barely enough to reach designated objectives, let alone engage in prolonged combat. Some commanders took drastic measures, ordering their troops to seize Allied fuel depots at all costs. This led to desperate skirmishes over gasoline drums and storage facilities, battles not for land, but for mobility. Without fuel, even the most advanced German tanks became nothing more than frozen steel bunkers. Allied air support remained limited in the early phase of the offensive. Heavy clouds, snow, and fog grounded planes across the region. Without fighter bombers to disrupt enemy movement, German troops were able to launch their offensive with minimal interference from the skies. This temporary advantage gave them an early momentum that threatened to break through the Allied line entirely. However, Allied commanders understood that once the weather cleared, their air superiority could drastically shift the momentum. As the battle expanded across the Ardennes, towns that had previously been spared the horrors of war found themselves engulfed in violence. Shells tore through rooftops. Fires spread uncontrollably across frozen streets. Civilians huddled in basements, listening to the relentless thunder of artillery and the rumble of tanks. Many attempted to flee, trudging through the snow with whatever belongings they could carry. Others remained trapped inside their homes, praying that the front line would pass them by quickly. Throughout the chaos, both sides displayed remarkable endurance. German soldiers fought with a mixture of determination and desperation, believing that this offensive represented their final chance to alter the war's direction. Allied troops, though unprepared, adapted quickly. Units that had been scattered or overwhelmed began to reorganize. Commanders on the ground demonstrated resourcefulness, redirecting reserves, establishing defensive pockets, and buying time for reinforcements to arrive. Even inexperienced soldiers found themselves rising to the challenge, driven by necessity and the instinct for survival. By the third day of the offensive, the shape of the German advance became clear on Allied maps. A deep, swollen protrusion in the line, one that pushed westward in a massive curve. This would become the name of the battle itself, the Bulge. Yet despite the initial success, cracks were already beginning to form in the German plan. Delays, supply shortages, and unexpected Allied resistance disrupted their timetable. Hitler's ambitious objective of reaching Antwerp began to drift further out of reach. Still, the fate of the Ardennes, and perhaps the war, remained uncertain. The opening phase had set the stage for a titanic struggle that would rage across frozen forests, shattered towns, and bloodied snowfields. The world watched with anxious anticipation as the largest battle fought by the United States Army in World War II intensified with each passing hour. The Battle of the Bulge entered its most violent and defining phase as German forces pushed deeper into the Ardennes, tightening their grip on vulnerable Allied positions and threatening to fracture the Western Front entirely. What had begun as a rapid, brutal surprise offensive now evolved into a vast and chaotic confrontation fought across snow-choked forests, bombed-out towns, and makeshift defensive lines hastily arranged by formations struggling to regroup. Day and night blended together under the smoke-filled sky as the German army sought desperately to drive a wedge between the Allied forces, while the Allies scrambled to halt the momentum of a foe who had seemed all but defeated just weeks earlier. This was the true crucible of the Ardennes, where strategy, courage, and sheer endurance would determine the fate of the front. The town of Bastogne became the central heartbeat of the conflict. Surrounded by dense forest and intersected by 7 critical roads, it was the logistical hub the Germans needed to advance westward. If the panzers captured Bastogne, they would gain access to a vital network of supply routes that could propel them toward the Meuse River. Recognizing this, Hitler ordered multiple divisions, including the experienced and heavily armored Panzer Lehr Division, to encircle the town swiftly. However, holding Bastogne were the hardened paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division, who dug themselves into the frozen earth with a ferocity born from necessity. Their foxholes, carved into permafrost and reinforced with whatever debris they could find, lined the woods in a ring around the town. These soldiers were cold, hungry, low on ammunition, and lacking winter clothing, yet they refused to abandon their positions. Clashes around Bastogne intensified with each passing hour. German artillery pounded the American defenses relentlessly, sending shockwaves through the icy ground and showering the forest with splinters. Trees snapped like brittle bones. Snow erupted into plumes under shell bursts. Communication trenches flooded with icy water. When the bombardments lifted, German infantry surged forward, supported by tanks that pushed through the snow with grinding determination. The defenders responded with a mixture of grit, improvisation, and sheer defiance. Anti-tank teams waited in the shadows, springing into action with bazookas and mines when enemy armor approached. Machine gun nests hidden beneath camouflage netting unleashed devastating fire when infantry formations advanced. Despite the overwhelming odds, the 101st Airborne held firm, establishing Bastogne as a symbol of resistance. Elsewhere along the Bulge, the fighting grew increasingly savage. In the north, American units scrambled to contain the push of Kampfgruppe, an elite SS armored group led by Joachim Paper. His forces consisted of some of Germany's best-equipped troops, including Tiger II tanks whose thick armor and massive guns dominated open-field engagements. Paper drove his men forward with ruthless intensity, cutting a path through American positions and seizing several towns in rapid succession. His advance left a trail of burning vehicles, wrecked artillery pieces, and shattered defensive lines. Yet his success was accompanied by brutality, most infamously at Malmedy, where his troops massacred American prisoners of war. News of the massacre spread quickly among Allied ranks, fueling a grim resolve. Many soldiers vowed never to surrender, knowing they might face execution. But Paper's momentum came at a cost. As his column pushed deeper into the Ardennes, the roads grew narrower, the resistance stiffer, and the fuel supplies dangerously thin. Heavy snowfall slowed movement, and the labyrinth of forested hills forced the armored column into long, vulnerable lines. American engineers blew bridges ahead of them, laid mines along key routes, and ambushed supply vehicles. Tanks ran dry of fuel, artillery pieces became immobile, and morale faltered as Paper realized he was surrounded. Eventually, his forces were forced to abandon their heavy equipment and retreat on foot through the freezing wilderness. The once feared Kampfgruppe Paper faded into the forest, its ambitions extinguished by terrain, weather, and the tenacity of the defenders. While the northern and central fronts erupted into chaos, the southern flank witnessed equally intense combat as German units attempted to expand the Bulge's base. Here, American divisions fought desperate holding actions, retreating when necessary but never breaking. Towns changed hands multiple times in a single day, their streets becoming mazes of rubble and shattered glass. Frozen bodies lay half-buried in snowdrifts, and the skies above were illuminated by the distant glow of burning villages. Tanks dueled at close range in narrow streets, their metal frames clashing like medieval armor, each shot echoing through the valleys. Infantrymen crawled through snow under machine gun fire, using wrecked vehicles as cover. Every step forward came at a staggering cost. As the battle raged, the weather became an unpredictable tyrant. Blizzard conditions returned, smothering both sides in whiteout blurs that erased the landscape. Soldiers described hearing enemy movements but being unable to see even a few meters ahead. Sentries listened to the crunch of boots in snow, unsure whether it was friendly or hostile. Artillery observers struggled to identify targets. Supply convoys vanished beneath sudden bursts of snowfall. Frostbite spread through the ranks with merciless efficiency, turning fingers black, stiffening limbs, and claiming more casualties than bullets in some areas. The cold became an ever-present enemy, draining strength, stealing breath, and sapping morale. Inside Bastogne, the situation grew critical. Medical supplies ran dangerously low. Surgeons operated in basements lit by lanterns, using blankets to keep patients warm. Ammunition dwindled. Food rations were stretched thin. Shells fell on the town day and night, reducing buildings to charred skeletons. Yet the defenders refused to yield. When the German commander demanded their surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with a single word, "Nuts." A declaration of defiance that echoed across the front and bolstered Allied morale. By December 23, the battle's momentum began to shift. A break in the clouds allowed Allied aircraft to take to the skies for the first time since the offensive began. Fighter bombers swooped down on German columns, destroying tanks, strafing supply routes, and halting reinforcements. Transport planes dropped desperately needed supplies into Bastogne, their parachutes blooming like white flowers against the winter sky. American morale surged as men realized they were no longer alone. At the same time, General Patton's Third Army executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war. In a matter of days, Patton pivoted 3 full divisions northward through treacherous winter roads to relieve Bastogne. His tanks and infantry pushed forward relentlessly, battling through German resistance and braving the snow-covered terrain. On December 26, Patton's forces broke through the German ring and reached the outskirts of Bastogne, delivering salvation to the besieged defenders. The town, though battered, remained in Allied hands, a pivotal moment that marked the beginning of the German offensive's collapse. From that point forward, the Battle of the Bulge turned into a brutal struggle of attrition. German units attempted to continue their advance, but the window of opportunity had closed. Fuel shortages crippled their armored divisions. Allied reinforcements flooded into the region. Air superiority allowed the Allies to strike at will, destroying retreating forces and cutting off supply lines. The bulge in the line began to shrink as American units counterattacked from both the north and south, compressing the German salient steadily. In the forests, Smaller engagements erupted continuously. Snipers watched frozen paths from hidden perches. Scouts moved silently between trees, seeking signs of enemy patrols. Artillery crews fired round after round at coordinates marked on frost-covered maps. Soldiers advanced through waist-deep snow, their breath forming clouds in the icy air. Machine guns chattered like mechanical bursts of anger. Mortars thumped in rhythmic patterns. The forest became a labyrinth of danger, where every ridge, every tree line, and every abandoned building could hide an enemy waiting to strike. The German collapse accelerated as January approached. Many units fell back, leaving behind destroyed equipment, frozen casualties, and a landscape scarred by weeks of desperate fighting. The Allies closed in on the shrinking Bulge, tightening the noose with coordinated offensives. Towns that had been captured during the initial days of the offensive were liberated one by one. Roads cleared of snow became arteries of Allied movement once again. The momentum, once firmly in German hands, now flowed decisively toward the Allies. Yet the cost was devastating. The snow-covered Ardennes became a graveyard for thousands. Forests were stripped bare by artillery. Entire battalions were reduced to scattered remnants. Fields lay littered with the wreckage of tanks and vehicles frozen in place. Soldiers on both sides carried the weight of exhaustion and loss. But through the hardship, a turning point had been reached. The German counteroffensive had been halted, then reversed. What was intended as a bold strike to divide and cripple the Allies had instead consumed the last reserves of German strength. The main battle of the Ardennes had come to an end, but its legacy, etched into the frozen soil and the memories of those who survived, would endure as one of the most brutal and consequential engagements of the Second World War. The frozen forests of the Ardennes, once alive with the thunder of artillery and the roar of tanks, gradually fell silent as the last echoes of the German offensive faded into the bitter winter air. The snow that had been trampled and stained with the blood of thousands of soldiers now lay still, a somber blanket over a landscape irrevocably changed by the relentless struggle. What had begun as a daring German gamble to divide the Allied forces and seize Antwerp ended in a costly failure, marking not only a pivotal turning point in the Western Front but also a clear demonstration of the resilience, determination, and strategic adaptability of the Allied armies. By early January, the German advance had been effectively halted. Key towns that had changed hands multiple times, Bastogne, Saint-Vith, and Malmedy, had been secured or reinforced by Allied forces. The bulge in the Allied line that had given the battle its name had begun to shrink under coordinated counterattacks. General Patton's Third Army continued to drive northward, exploiting weaknesses in the German flanks, while units that had endured weeks of siege emerged from Bastogne and other besieged towns to reclaim territory. American soldiers, once caught off guard by the sudden onslaught, demonstrated remarkable flexibility and tactical ingenuity, adapting quickly to harsh winter conditions, overcoming logistical challenges, and using the terrain to their advantage to counter the enemy. The human cost of the battle was staggering. More than 19,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing, and the German losses were equally catastrophic, with estimates exceeding 80,000 casualties, including those who had been captured or permanently incapacitated. Entire battalions were decimated, leaving only scattered remnants to regroup and retreat. Armored divisions lost hundreds of tanks, many of them immobilized in the snow or destroyed in combat. Artillery pieces and supply trucks littered the roadsides, frozen and abandoned, testifying to the intensity of the fighting and the challenges imposed by both enemy action and the unforgiving winter conditions. Medical personnel struggled to tend to the wounded in sub-zero temperatures, improvising triage stations in cellars, basements, and makeshift shelters, and performing life-saving surgeries under candlelight. The battle also exposed critical weaknesses in German planning. While the initial surprise achieved tactical success, overextension of forces, inadequate fuel, and the inability to anticipate rapid Allied mobilization ultimately doomed the offensive. The harsh winter, which the Germans had assumed would hinder the Allies more than themselves, turned against the attackers. Snow and ice slowed armored advances, obscured reconnaissance, and contributed to logistical bottlenecks. When the weather finally cleared, Allied air power proved decisive. Fighter bombers targeted supply columns, destroyed armored vehicles, and disrupted troop movements, denying the Germans any opportunity to regain momentum. The failure of Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's ambitious strategy, marked the last significant German offensive on the Western Front. From a strategic perspective, The outcome of the Battle of the Bulge reshaped the trajectory of the war in Western Europe. The Germans had hoped to force a negotiated settlement with the Western Allies by demonstrating the vulnerability of their positions, but instead, the offensive exhausted the Wehrmacht's remaining reserves. Following the battle, German forces could no longer mount a large-scale attack in the West. Conversely, the Allies emerged stronger, both materially and psychologically. Lessons learned during the Ardennes campaign, regarding rapid response to surprise attacks, winter combat preparedness, and the importance of maintaining robust supply lines, would inform subsequent operations as the Allies advanced into Germany. The resilience of units like the 101st Airborne at Bastogne and the coordinated maneuvers of Patton's Third Army became defining examples of leadership, morale, and tactical ingenuity. Civilians, too, bore witness to the battle's devastating effects. Towns were left in ruins, with homes reduced to rubble, streets blocked by debris, and infrastructure destroyed. Families were displaced, seeking refuge wherever shelter could be found in the freezing temperatures. Food and water were scarce, and survivors were forced to rely on military aid or the generosity of neighbors to endure the harsh conditions. Yet amidst the devastation, stories of courage, compassion, and solidarity emerged. Local inhabitants guided soldiers through treacherous terrain, shared scarce resources, and, in some cases, protected the wounded from the harsh winter elements. Their resilience and support played a critical role in stabilizing defensive positions and sustaining morale during one of the most challenging periods of the war. The outcome of the Battle of the Bulge was also a psychological turning point. For the Allies, the successful defense and counteroffensive reinforced confidence in their ability to repel German initiatives and highlighted the growing effectiveness of coordination between American, British, and other Allied forces. Conversely, the failure of the German offensive had a demoralizing effect on the Wehrmacht. The loss of troops, equipment, and initiative further reduced Hitler's capacity to influence the Western Front, signaling the beginning of an inexorable retreat toward Germany's heartland. The Ardennes, once chosen for its perceived advantage, had become a site of German vulnerability and ultimate defeat. While the military and strategic outcomes were decisive, the personal toll of the battle remained profound. Soldiers on both sides carried injuries, trauma, and memories of harrowing experiences in frozen forests and burning towns. Survivors recounted the chaos of sudden attacks, the deafening roar of artillery, and the relentless cold that numbed fingers, froze feet, and sapped energy. Others described the courage of comrades who risked their lives to rescue wounded soldiers, distribute ammunition, or hold a critical position against overwhelming odds. These individual acts of bravery contributed to the broader outcome, illustrating how human resilience and determination can influence the course of a major military engagement. In the aftermath, the Ardennes slowly returned to silence. The roads, once crisscrossed with tanks and supply convoys, were littered with wreckage and scarred by the passage of armies. Forests were stripped of cover in areas where artillery had raged for days. Villages, though rebuilding would begin, remained reminders of the human cost of conflict. As winter receded and spring approached, the region bore witness not only to the resilience of its defenders but also to the lessons of preparation, coordination, and strategic foresight that would shape subsequent Allied campaigns. Ultimately, the Battle of the Bulge demonstrated that even in the face of surprise, harsh environmental conditions, and overwhelming initial pressure, disciplined forces with strong leadership, high morale, and adaptability could withstand and reverse the momentum of a formidable offensive. It solidified the reputation of units like the 101st Airborne, highlighted the strategic brilliance of Allied command, and underscored the limitations of German operational planning in the latter stages of the war. The Ardennes had tested every soldier, every officer, and every civilian caught in its grip, leaving behind a legacy of endurance, sacrifice, and decisive victory that would resonate throughout the remaining months of the Second World War. Amid the vast expanse of the Ardennes battlefield, the human dimension of the conflict became both stark and unforgettable. The immense scale of the Battle of the Bulge, with tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians caught in the throes of winter warfare, meant that history could not be told solely through statistics and military maneuvers. It had to be understood through the lives, experiences, and memories of the individuals who endured its relentless chaos. Their stories, of courage, fear, despair, and resilience, provide a window into the realities of a conflict that tested every human limit. Private James McConnell, a young paratrooper of the 101st Airborne Division, recalled the night before Bastogne was encircled. He had dug his foxhole under the skeletal remains of a fallen barn, huddled with 3 comrades against the bitter wind. Frostbite had already begun to claim their fingers and toes, and rations consisted of a few hard biscuits and a thermos of coffee that had cooled into a near-solid slush. Despite the cold, McConnell remembered the laughter that occasionally broke the tension, a shared joke about home, a letter from a sister, a whispered promise to survive. Yet, when the German artillery began its pre-dawn bombardment, all levity vanished. He later recounted how the explosions made the ground tremble beneath them, sending shards of wood and frozen soil into the air, as the cries of wounded men echoed through the forest. He and his fellow soldiers responded with a mixture of training, instinct, and sheer survival instinct, holding their positions despite the overwhelming assault. In another sector, Sergeant Klaus Weber of the German 26th Volksgrenadier Division experienced the offensive from the other side of the front. Weber, a veteran of the Eastern Front, was accustomed to hardship, yet the Ardennes presented a different kind of trial. He marched through snow up to his knees, dragging artillery shells behind him, while frost pierced his uniform and bit into exposed skin. He remembered the tension among his unit. Officers barked orders over the wind, vehicles slid helplessly on icy roads, and younger recruits questioned whether the offensive could succeed. Still, Weber pressed forward, motivated by a sense of duty, indoctrination, and the belief that success in the Ardennes could change the course of the war. His personal diary would later describe the mix of fear and exhilaration as his unit advanced toward Bastogne, the forest around them alive with the sound of gunfire, explosions, and shouting. Civilians also endured unimaginable hardship. In the small village of Noville, Belgian families huddled in basements while artillery shells tore through their homes. Marie Dupont, a mother of 4, recounted how she wrapped her children in blankets and pressed them to the ground, listening to the terrifying cacophony above. The family had limited food and no access to medical supplies, yet she remained determined to protect them. Neighbors shared what little they had, forming makeshift shelters in cellars and abandoned buildings. Dupont would later recall the courage of a young soldier, barely older than her eldest son, who risked his life to deliver a message to another Allied unit, ensuring that supplies could reach those trapped in the village. Lieutenant Robert Bob Anderson, an officer in the 10th Armored Division, provided another lens into the battle's personal dimension. During the defense of St. Vith, his unit faced repeated German attacks and relentless artillery bombardments. Anderson described the physical exhaustion, soldiers staggering through snow, carrying ammunition and equipment, often without sleep for days. Yet the psychological strain was equally severe. He wrote about the constant tension, the fleeting moments of quiet when men feared that a single misstep could lead to death, and the brief flashes of hope when a counterattack succeeded or reinforcements arrived. His leadership, he later reflected, was shaped not by grand strategy alone but by the necessity of keeping men alive, maintaining morale, and improvising solutions under fire. Medical personnel faced their own harrowing challenges. Nurse Margaret Sullivan of a field hospital outside Bastogne recounted performing surgeries by lantern light while temperatures inside the makeshift wards hovered near freezing. Frost formed on blankets and surgical instruments alike. Patients shivered uncontrollably, some succumbing to hypothermia even as their wounds were treated. Sullivan described the immense strain of triage, deciding who could be saved, who required immediate attention, and who had little chance of survival. Her memoirs captured both the physical exhaustion and the emotional toll of witnessing humans suffering on an unprecedented scale, emphasizing the courage and compassion required to maintain care under such dire conditions. In the midst of the chaos, acts of heroism and humanity emerged. Corporal Thomas Riley, tasked with delivering ammunition across a stretch of forest exposed to enemy fire, described navigating a field pockmarked by shell craters while bullets ricocheted off nearby trees. At one point, he encountered a wounded German soldier, stranded and freezing in the snow. Riley hesitated, knowing that helping the enemy could risk his life, but he chose to drag the man to safety, providing water and warmth before returning to his own lines. Such incidents, though rare, highlighted the complexity of human behavior under extreme conditions, reminding observers that even in a battle defined by strategy and carnage, individual choices could reflect morality and empathy. The experiences of German soldiers, meanwhile, illustrated the immense strain imposed by both the offensive and the environment. Unteroffizier Dieter Koch described pushing his Panther tank through narrow forest roads, often immobilized by snow or ice, while facing artillery fire and ambushes. Supply shortages forced him to scavenge fuel and food, leading to improvisation under pressure. The psychological weight was immense. The failure of the offensive became increasingly evident with each lost town, every destroyed vehicle, and the steady arrival of Allied reinforcements. Koch later reflected on the bitter irony of fighting for a plan that was ambitious, well-planned, but ultimately doomed by circumstances beyond his control. Even the youngest soldiers experienced the battle's intensity. Private First Class William "Billy" Thompson, just 19, recalled his first encounter with close-range combat near the town of Foy. A sudden German assault left his platoon pinned in a frozen ditch. Bullets tore through the snow and trees around him, and artillery blasts threw him to the ground repeatedly. Yet, in those moments, Thompson discovered his capacity for courage, endurance, and quick decision-making. He described how he and a few comrades improvised defenses using logs, debris, and snow banks, holding their position long enough to allow reinforcements to arrive. These experiences, seared into memory, would shape his understanding of both the horror and the human capacity to endure extreme adversity. Among the civilian population, stories of quiet courage abounded. Local Belgian farmers guided retreating Allied soldiers through hidden paths in the forests, knowing that German patrols could capture or kill them. Villagers shared food and clothing, often at great personal risk. In towns partially occupied by German forces, residents negotiated with soldiers to protect families, prevent looting, or safeguard medical supplies. These actions were often unrecorded in official histories, yet they were instrumental in sustaining both morale and survival during the grueling weeks of the offensive. Letters, diaries, and post-war memoirs from participants of both sides reveal a mosaic of human experience. They recount moments of sheer terror, flashes of ingenuity, acts of profound selflessness, and the constant presence of cold, hunger, and exhaustion. These accounts complement official military records by adding depth, color, and personal perspective to the otherwise impersonal narrative of strategy and movement. They highlight the human cost of war, the resilience of those caught in its grip, and the profound psychological and emotional impact of sustained combat in extreme conditions. The Battle of the Bulge, therefore, cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the individual experiences that shaped it. From young recruits facing their first engagement to seasoned veterans confronting the collapse of a meticulously planned offensive, from medics performing miracles under impossible conditions to civilians navigating a war-torn landscape, the human element defines the battle as much as the strategic and tactical maneuvers. These stories collectively demonstrate the courage, endurance, and resourcefulness of those who survived the Ardennes, ensuring that the history of the Bulge is not only a chronicle of military movements but also a testament to the capacity of humans to endure, resist, and act with bravery even amidst overwhelming adversity. The Battle of the Bulge, beyond its immediate military significance, is a treasure trove of historical details, tactical lessons, and little-known facts that continue to fascinate scholars, historians, and military enthusiasts decades later. Every element of the engagement, from its inception to its conclusion, reveals layers of complexity, planning, improvisation, and human endurance that extend far beyond the conventional narratives of World War II. By examining these additional facets, one can gain a more nuanced understanding of how geography, technology, leadership, and sheer chance converged to shape one of the most consequential confrontations on the Western Front. One of the most striking aspects of the Ardennes offensive was the extent of German preparation and secrecy. Known under the codename Wacht am Rhein, the plan aimed to deliver a decisive blow to the Allied forces in the West, ideally capturing Antwerp and splitting the American and British armies. The operation involved meticulous coordination among multiple panzer divisions, elite infantry units, airborne commandos, and specialized support elements. Despite limited resources, including severe shortages of fuel and winter clothing, the Germans invested months into training and rehearsing maneuvers in forested areas that mimicked the Ardennes terrain. Soldiers practiced night advances, bridge seizures, and infiltration tactics, ensuring that the first wave could move with maximum surprise. This level of preparation was unprecedented in late-stage German operations, reflecting both the desperation and the ingenuity of the Wehrmacht leadership. Interestingly, the Ardennes region itself had been underestimated by both sides. Its dense forests, steep ridges, and narrow roads were considered unsuited for large-scale armored warfare, leading many Allied planners to believe it an unlikely target for a major offensive. The Germans exploited this assumption, using the forest cover to conceal troop movements and armored columns. Snow and fog provided additional protection, temporarily blinding Allied reconnaissance and delaying the deployment of air support. Yet these same factors created formidable logistical challenges for the attackers, slowing advances, causing vehicles to become stuck, and forcing improvisation under pressure. The interplay between terrain and strategy exemplifies how environmental conditions can both aid and hinder military operations simultaneously. Another remarkable detail is the role of weather in shaping the battle's outcome. For the initial days of the offensive, heavy cloud cover and blizzards grounded Allied aircraft, allowing German forces to advance with minimal disruption from the air. This temporary advantage was a critical factor in the early success of the attack, enabling tanks and infantry to move rapidly and achieve surprise. However, when the weather cleared, the Allies unleashed the full power of their air forces, demonstrating the decisive impact of air superiority. Fighter bombers strafed retreating columns, destroyed supply depots, and provided close support to embattled ground units. The contrast between these two phases of the battle highlights the extent to which meteorological conditions can directly influence operational effectiveness and outcomes in combat. Fuel scarcity was another decisive factor. German armored divisions, including the feared Tiger and Panther tanks, were initially expected to operate at peak effectiveness. In reality, the offensive relied on precarious supply lines that were frequently disrupted by snow, Allied counterattacks, and destroyed infrastructure. Many tanks ran dry or were abandoned, immobilized by either mechanical failure or the terrain. Engineers improvised fuel transfer operations under fire, but the cumulative effect of shortages slowed the advance and contributed to the eventual failure of the offensive. Conversely, the Allies were able to leverage their superior logistical networks to maintain supply, rotate troops, and reinforce critical positions like Bastogne, underscoring the enduring importance of logistics in modern warfare. The battle also produced instances of innovative improvisation on both sides. American soldiers, for example, often melted snow to supplement drinking water, used debris and logs to reinforce defensive positions, and repurposed captured German equipment to bolster their firepower. The defenders at Bastogne famously endured days without adequate food, water, or medical supplies, yet adapted to maintain combat readiness. German soldiers employed winter camouflage, coordinated multi-pronged attacks, and used captured Allied vehicles to infiltrate enemy lines. These adaptive strategies illustrate the interplay between planning, improvisation, and survival in the face of dynamic and unpredictable conditions. Individual acts of heroism and unusual incidents add additional layers to the battle's history. One notable story involves the use of improvised flamethrowers and thermite charges by American engineers to destroy German vehicles stuck in the snow. Another recounts how a single artillery unit, isolated for days behind enemy lines, maintained its fire against approaching German armor, slowing an advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive. German commandos, including Otto Skorzeny's units, conducted daring operations in American uniforms, occasionally misleading or delaying entire divisions. These events, while tactical in nature, also reveal the psychological dimension of warfare. Fear, deception, and ingenuity often determined outcomes as much as sheer firepower. The battle's effect on civilian populations is another critical historical facet. Villages in the Ardennes, many of which had been spared from combat for years, suddenly became battlegrounds. Homes were destroyed, roads obstructed, and civilians forced to seek shelter in basements or flee into forests. Relief efforts were often hampered by both the weather and ongoing military operations, leaving inhabitants reliant on the fortitude of neighbors and soldiers for survival. Accounts from Belgian civilians describe a complex mixture of fear, resilience, and solidarity. Some families aided retreating soldiers, guided the wounded to safety, or negotiated with occupying forces to preserve lives and property. These contributions, though rarely highlighted in military histories, were essential to sustaining morale and survival during the offensive. Strategically, the Ardennes offensive serves as a case study in both ambition and overreach. German planners sought a rapid, decisive maneuver to split Allied forces, yet underestimated the logistical, environmental, and operational challenges. Initial gains, impressive in scale, proved unsustainable as fuel ran low, roads became impassable, and Allied resistance stiffened. By contrast, the Allied command's flexibility, rapid redeployment, improvisation, and effective use of reinforcements demonstrated the importance of adaptability in modern combat. The battle offers enduring lessons for military scholars. Surprise can yield early advantage, but long-term success depends on coordination, logistics, and the capacity to sustain operations under adverse conditions. The Ardennes offensive also revealed the psychological dimensions of warfare. German troops, driven by both ideological commitment and desperation, demonstrated determination and bravery, but faced immense stress and fatigue. Allied soldiers, initially caught off guard, displayed remarkable resilience under pressure. The sustained intensity of combat, the brutal winter environment, and the close proximity of life and death encounters forged bonds of camaraderie and resilience among soldiers. These human elements, fear, courage, determination, were as decisive as tanks and artillery in shaping the trajectory of the battle. Additionally, the Battle of the Bulge has been the subject of extensive post-war analysis and commemoration. Historians have examined operational orders, unit movements, and logistical challenges to reconstruct the offensive with astonishing detail. Museums and memorials in Belgium, Luxembourg, and the United States preserve the memory of soldiers who fought and civilians who endured the ordeal. Veterans' testimonies provide insight into the personal experience of combat, offering depth and nuance that official records alone cannot convey. The combination of material artifacts, documentary evidence, and oral histories ensures that the lessons, heroism, and tragedies of the Ardennes remain accessible to future generations. Finally, the Ardennes offensive had lasting strategic implications. Its failure depleted German reserves, accelerated the Allied advance into Germany, and reinforced the growing inevitability of German defeat in the West. For the Allies, the battle highlighted the critical importance of logistics, weather preparedness, rapid response to unexpected offensives, and the ability to maintain morale under extreme conditions. The Battle of the Bulge stands as a testament not only to the tactical and operational dimensions of warfare but also to the enduring human capacity to endure, adapt, and prevail in circumstances of extreme adversity. Its lessons continue to inform military doctrine, historical scholarship, and our collective understanding of the Second World War. The Ardennes, scarred yet resilient, remains a symbol of endurance, courage, and the complex interplay between strategy, environment, and human determination. Every snow-covered ridge, every frozen road, and every small village carries within it the echoes of thousands who fought, suffered, and endured. These historical details, often overlooked in broad narratives, illuminate the Battle of the Bulge not merely as a military engagement but as a profound human event, one that encapsulates the extremities of war, the limits of planning, and the extraordinary capacities of those who faced its challenges head-on.